Ethan Harper knew his mind was shattered. But what he saw in the mirror that night was something even the worst depression couldn't explain. His reflection blinked at him. Only the reflection did while he remained still, paralyzed by the growing dread that wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't stress. The crooked smile appearing on the other side wasn't his. Ethan took a step back, but the reflection didn't. It stayed there in that old mirror, smiling as if it knew something Ethan didn't. Ethan's life had fallen apart in a matter of months. Since the painful breakup with Claire, everything felt out of control. They had been together for nearly a decade, but in the end, their love was consumed by a spiral of resentment and silence. And then came the goodbye. Ethan didn't know how to deal with the loss. Depression consumed him like a slow fire, and he decided he needed to run away. Where did he go? The old house of his childhood in Bangor, Maine. The house wasn't exactly in good condition, but it was shelter. An old wooden house with long corridors and more mirrors than he cared to admit. His grandmother had a strange obsession with mirrors, and since her death they had remained everywhere. Large and small mirrors, round and oval, some framed in aged silver, others almost faded with time. On the second day after his arrival, Ethan began dusting the house. Nostalgia filled him with melancholy, as if the place were a time capsule full of ghosts. He spent hours cleaning rooms he hadn't seen since his teenage years. But it was in the attic that he found something that sent a chill down his spine. A huge mirror, covered by a heavy, dark cloth. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the mirror as if expecting something to move beneath the fabric. But there was nothing, only silence and darkness. Determined to put the object to some use, Ethan pulled the mirror out and hung it in the main hallway of the house. It was an elegant mirror with a worn golden frame and a few subtle cracks along the edges. Nothing that stood out too much. For the first few days, he hardly paid attention to it. He was busy trying to reorganize his life. Simple tasks like paying bills and tending the garden occupied his mind. But soon, the nights began to feel longer, lonelier, and the darkness inside the house seemed denser. It was on one of those nights, as he crossed the hallway toward the kitchen, that he noticed something. He stopped abruptly as he passed the mirror. There was something in the reflection. Ethan looked at his reflected face. Tired, worn out, with deep, dark circles. But something was off. He frowned, approaching the mirror. His reflection didn't seem synchronized. The smile forming was almost imperceptible, but it was there at the corner of his lips. Ethan knew he wasn't smiling. He felt a chill crawl up his spine and quickly backed away, attributing it all to exhaustion. The brain plays strange tricks when you're tired, right? In the following days, he tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was just his frayed nerves playing tricks, but every time he crossed the hallway, his reflection seemed a little different, more alive, almost as if it had thoughts of its own. One night, he glanced at the mirror and nearly stopped to take a closer look, but decided he was already paranoid enough. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to himself, forcing a laugh. His depression was worsening and he knew he needed help, but who would he turn to? Claire? Impossible. Then one night everything changed. Ethan was walking out of the kitchen holding a cup of coffee when he glanced at the mirror. He stopped, his blood freezing in his veins. His reflection was no longer just mimicking his movements. The Ethan in the mirror smiled. Not a normal smile, it was something crooked, a smile he had never made in his life. An almost malicious expression. He dropped the cup, which shattered on the floor. The reflection, however, remained, smiling as if it knew something he didn't. Ethan took a step back, blinking several times, hoping it would disappear. But the smile remained. When he finally ran away, not looking back, he felt his heart racing, panic rising. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. That night he barely slept. The thoughts of the mirror haunted him. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just his mind, his unbalanced psychological state. But a part of him knew deep down that wasn't it. The mirror was alive somehow, and he knew it. Ethan woke up with a start. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, and for a brief moment, he thought it had all been just a nightmare. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he ran his hands over his face, trying to shake off the cloud of confusion surrounding him. The broken cup in the kitchen, however, proved that what had happened the night before was real. The smile, that damn smile. During breakfast, he avoided the hallway where the mirror was hung. Every time he thought about crossing that space, panic took hold. Something was deeply wrong with that reflection. Just the thought of looking at it again made Ethan's heart race. His mind tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the effects of post-divorce stress. He was going through a rough time. Things like this happened, right? That afternoon, while trying to distract himself with mundane tasks, the silence in the house became deafening. No TV, no radio, just the faint sound of the wind brushing against the trees outside. Deep down, he knew he was avoiding the mirror, trying his hardest not to think about what happened the night before. But the silence, combined with the loneliness, made everything worse. Ethan's already fragile mind began to wander, spinning crazy theories about what could be happening. Late in the afternoon, he decided he needed to face it. It was the only way to prove to himself that he was just imagining things. Taking a deep breath, he approached the hallway. The large, imposing mirror reflected the soft light of the evening. And there he was, standing a few feet away, contemplating his own reflection. Ethan's stomach churned. He looked at himself. Everything seemed normal except for the tired eyes staring back at him. He stood there for a few minutes, staring at his own reflection, waiting for something to happen, but nothing. No strange movement, no smile. Maybe, in fact, it had just been a delusion caused by exhaustion. A sigh of relief escaped his lips, but as he began to turn away, he froze. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. His reflection was still there, standing. But the face now had that smile again. Not the same tired, natural smile, but something twisted, like someone trying to imitate a human expression without fully understanding how. The smile slowly widened, curving in an unnatural way. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He turned to face the mirror, eyes wide, panic flooding his veins. His mouth was closed. He was sure of it, but the reflection was smiling, as if enjoying his suffering. This time he didn't run. Instead, he advanced toward the mirror, his eyes fixed on the smiling figure. Fear was replaced by a mixture of anger and despair. He shook his head, muttering to himself that it was impossible, that he was on the verge of a breakdown. He pressed his hands against the cold, smooth surface of the glass, his fingers digging into it as if he could somehow break the illusion. His reflection did the same, but the smile never disappeared. "What do you want from me?" Ethan whispered, the words slipping from his mouth as if he feared something on the other side might hear. The smile on the reflection only widened. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding wildly. He turned away from the mirror, fear surging inside him. He grabbed his phone, desperate to capture what was happening, as if recording it could somehow make sense of it all. He returned to the hallway and positioned the camera in front of the mirror, making sure it captured his entire reflection. When he checked the video, his stomach sank. The reflection was normal. No smile, no strange movements, just him, standing, staring back at himself. Ethan's hands shook as he watched the video again. Nothing. Everything seemed normal in the recording. His mind began to whirl with explanations. Could it have been a hallucination caused by stress? The paranoia of someone emotionally fragile? Or something worse? That night, the nightmares returned. Ethan dreamed he was trapped inside the mirror, watching himself from the other side, unable to scream for help. Outside, he saw his own body living his life, smiling at people, talking to Claire as if nothing had happened. But the smile, that damn smile, was always there, curving his lips in a bizarre way as if mocking the anguish he felt. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He knew there was something about that mirror, something he still couldn't understand, but that was growing, feeding on his sanity. And somehow he knew this was just the beginning. Ethan woke up that morning with the distinct feeling that the mirror was watching him. He tried to push the thought away, but it was like a mental itch he couldn't ignore. With every movement around the house, even deliberately avoiding the hallway, he felt as though a presence was lurking. Silent, but undeniable. The nightmares worsened that week. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, something was deeply wrong. And the feeling that there was something behind that reflection was overwhelming. He began to wonder if this was the start of a spiral into madness, or if there was truly something terrible lurking. One afternoon, in a desperate act, Ethan decided he needed to find out more about the mirror. There was something he was missing, some connection to the house's past. It was hard to ignore the fact that his grandmother's obsession with mirrors had always been strange, but he had never questioned it. She collected mirrors as if they were treasures, and no one ever knew why. Maybe he thought that was the key to understanding what was happening. Ethan climbed up to the attic, the same place where he had found the mirror. The light was dim and the air was filled with the smell of old wood and dust. He rummaged through old boxes full of trinkets and objects no one had touched in years. Among old photos and dusty albums, he found what he was looking for: a diary. His grandfather's name, Henry Harper, was engraved on the worn leather cover. He didn't know much about his grandfather. Henry had died when Ethan was just a child, and no one in the family talked much about him. But now, holding the diary in his hands, a wave of curiosity washed over him. Maybe his grandfather had gone through something similar. Ethan quickly went back downstairs, sitting on the living room chair as he began to flip through the yellowed pages. The diary started with common entries, detailing the grandfather's daily life in the house, his routine activities. But as he continued reading, something changed. The final pages began to take a darker tone. "Something is wrong with the mirrors," read an entry dated a few months before his death. "I see things that shouldn't be there. My reflection, it moves without me. At first I thought it was my imagination, but now I know there's something more." Ethan felt his blood turn cold as he read those words. His grandfather had experienced exactly what he was going through: the independent reflection, the distorted smiles. The diary continued with Henry describing his growing paranoia. He began covering the mirrors in the house with cloths, but even then, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In one particularly disturbing entry, Henry wrote, "I tried to destroy one of the mirrors today, but instead of breaking it cracked, and I heard a whisper. Something is on the other side, something that wants to come out." Ethan's breathing quickened. His grandfather's words felt like a prophecy of his own situation. He quickly flipped through the final pages where the entries became more desperate. Henry began to believe that the mirrors were portals to another world, a dark world, where something evil waited to take the place of the living. The diary ended abruptly. The last entry simply said, "I don't know how much longer I can resist. It's there on the other side watching me, waiting. It wants to be me." Ethan slammed the diary shut, feeling his stomach churn. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, confirming his worst fears. The entity in the mirror, it was trying to do the same thing to him, trying to take his place. Ethan's hands trembled as he held the diary in his lap. What his grandfather had described was happening to him now. The reflection, the smile, the feeling of being watched. It all made sense. He wasn't going crazy. There was something real, something evil, trying to cross that barrier of glass. He knew what he had to do. The same thing his grandfather had tried: destroy the mirror. But a part of him hesitated. What if it made things worse? What if by trying to get rid of the mirror he opened a path for the entity? Ethan didn't have all the answers, but the fear of losing his sanity, or worse, his identity, forced him to act. He stood from the chair, his legs shaky, and looked toward the hallway where the mirror hung. The reflection was waiting for him, as always, motionless, but now with a silent threat behind that glass. Ethan felt a wave of panic wash over him, but he knew he couldn't run anymore. It was him or the entity. Ethan knew he couldn't wait any longer. Every second that passed felt like it was bringing him closer to the edge of a cliff, and the reflection, or whatever it was in the mirror, waited patiently for him to fall. He had to act, and fast. The decision hit him like a shock. He would go down to the garage, grab the heaviest hammer he could find, and end this. Destroy the mirror. Free himself from its influence. That had to work. It had to work. With hurried steps, Ethan went down to the garage. He rummaged through the dusty shelves and found an old iron hammer, the wooden handle worn with age. He gripped it tightly as if the object were a weapon that could free him from his torment. He felt foolish for being so terrified of something as simple as a mirror, but at the same time, a deep terror grew inside him. There was something terribly wrong with that house, and that mirror was at the center of it all. He climbed the stairs with the hammer in hand, the weight of responsibility and fear pressing on him with every step. When he reached the hallway, the mirror was there, hanging as usual, but now it looked different, darker, more alive. His reflection standing inside it watched him. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine as he realized the reflection was smiling again. But this time, it wasn't subtle. It was a full, grotesque smile, distorting Ethan's face in an inhuman way. Ethan tightened his grip on the hammer, taking a deep breath to steady himself. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to destroy it once and for all. Without further hesitation, he raised the hammer above his head and brought it down with all his strength against the mirror. The impact echoed through the house like thunder. The glass didn't shatter as he expected. Instead, a single crack formed. Cutting the mirror from top to bottom in a winding line, Ethan stepped back, his heart racing. He had expected the mirror to break into pieces, but what happened was far worse. At the exact moment the hammer struck the glass, Ethan heard something. A whisper. Not a normal sound, but something that came from right inside view in the mirror. A muffled, distant sound, as if a voice was trying to cross the barrier between worlds. He froze, the hammer still in his hand, staring at the crack that now split his reflection in two. The distorted smile remained on the face of the Ethan inside the mirror, but now it seemed to move in a more unsettling way, contorting along the line of the crack, and then he saw it. On the other side of the crack, in the reflection of the hallway, something moved. It wasn't him. It wasn't his image in the mirror. There was something else there. Something moving in the darkness beyond the reflection. His heart pounded uncontrollably as he slowly backed away, his eyes wide. He didn't want to believe it, but there was something, or someone, on the other side. Panic gripped Ethan. The whisper grew louder, unintelligible words he couldn't understand. But that sounded like a call, a dark invitation. He had to get out of there now. Abandoning the hammer, he ran away from the mirror without looking back, feeling as if he were being followed by that presence. When he reached the living room, he stopped to catch his breath. Leaning against the wall, sweat running down his face. His hands trembled, and his thoughts were jumbled. What had he done? What had he unleashed? The panic was soon replaced by an even more horrifying realization. When Ethan looked at the large mirror in the living room, the smile in the reflection was still there, curved in a triumphant expression. But now every other mirror in the house began to show the same thing. The reflection in each of them, from the small bathroom mirrors to the large mirror in the living room, displayed that same distorted figure with the grotesque and inhuman smile. And worse yet, Ethan realized they weren't just smiling, they were watching. Their eyes followed him wherever he went, even if he wasn't directly in front of any mirror. In desperation, he ran to the kitchen and grabbed towels, blankets, anything he could use to cover the mirrors. He covered as many as he could, feeling watched every second, the air around him growing thick and suffocating. But even after covering them, Ethan knew that wouldn't solve the problem. The evil he had awakened was already everywhere. He could feel it even without seeing. He could hear them. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. I tried to destroy one of the mirrors. I heard a whisper. Something is on the other side. Ethan sat on the floor, his body trembling, his gaze lost. He didn't know how much longer he could resist. Something on the other side of the mirror wanted to cross over, and with each passing second it seemed closer to doing so. Ethan felt the weight of despair growing. Covering the mirrors hadn't brought any relief. Even without seeing them directly, he could feel them there on the other side, watching, waiting. The silence inside the house had become unbearable, suffocating. He paced back and forth in the living room, his mind spinning in circles. The only thing he knew for certain was that there was no escape. The mirrors surrounded him like portals in every direction, and Ethan knew that something had already crossed into his world. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was an entity, something twisted and inhuman, now watching every move he made. Suddenly he heard a sound, a soft crack coming from the hallway, the sound of glass splintering. Like a faint pulse growing louder with each passing second, his body stiffened. His breathing quickened. The mirror in the hallway, he knew something had changed. Ethan forced his feet to move, each step echoing in his mind like he was marching toward his own destruction. When he reached the hallway, his eyes fell on the cracked mirror. He saw the reflection now moving almost independently. The smile was still there, but the eyes of his reflection were no longer the same. There was something deeply wrong with them. They were dark, hollow, like he was staring into two endless voids. The crack in the glass now looked like a portal, and on the other side, a presence was forming. Panic gripped Ethan. He tried to step away, but his feet felt glued to the floor as if the entity was extending its influence over him. "Aku, let me out," whispered a voice inside his mind, deep and insistent. He turned, trying to resist the force pulling him toward the mirror, but the sensation of losing control was unbearable. He couldn't fight it. Then he saw something that chilled him to his core. The reflection began to perfectly imitate his movements without the distorted smile, without the hollow eyes. Now, it was like looking at himself, but something was wrong. The reflection felt more real, more present than he did. It felt like his own identity was being sucked into that reflection, little by little. Fear paralyzed him. The smile was fading, and instead of being distorted, the reflection now stared back at him with a neutral expression. There was no longer any malice on the reflection's face, but there was no life either. It was empty. But at the same time, he knew it was waiting to take his place. Ethan felt a sudden tightness in his chest. He realized that without knowing, he had begun to make small gestures, like moving his hands or blinking. But it wasn't him controlling them. His body was responding to a command that didn't come from his own mind. It was like the reflection was taking control. "Let me out. You no longer belong in this world." The voice sounded again, now clear, almost like an echo in his thoughts. Desperate, Ethan looked around, trying to find a way to save himself, but then he knew there was no salvation. The mirror was the door, and he was already too close to being sucked into the other side. The entity had done exactly what it wanted. The feeling of helplessness overwhelmed him, and the smile on the reflection began to return. But now, it was him smiling in a distorted and inhuman way. He tried to resist, but with every passing second he felt his consciousness slipping away, like water escaping between his fingers. Deep down, he knew the mirror was winning. His mind was being taken slowly, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ethan looked one last time at the reflection, or what was left of him, as his body, now controlled by the entity, moved automatically. He was being erased, replaced. The smile on the reflection curved into a grotesque arc, triumphant. The entity had won, and now he was made the other. Days passed. The house, now empty, was put up for sale. A young woman named Sarah came to view the property. As she walked through the rooms, her eyes fell on the cracked mirror in the hallway. She smiled at herself as she adjusted her hair, but for a brief moment she hesitated. Something about the reflection seemed slightly off, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, a smile she had never made.